Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm glad to welcome Andy Smarick to the program. Andy Smarick is the director of the Civil Society Work and Education Project, the R Street Institute. Before that, he was the president of the Maryland State Board of Education and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also been the deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. He's the author and editor of 4 books on education, and they run the gamut from urban schools to rural schools to Catholic schools. Andy Smarick, we're glad to have you.
Oh, it's such a thrill to be here. I've been a long-time listener.
Oh, good. Wonderful. So here to talk about your recent essay in National Affairs on decentralization, which is a very interesting essay. One of the reasons I thought it is worth discussing is you hit on something that Michael Novak, in one of his books on the common good, had indicated should be developed, and that's the interesting synthesis and tension between Friedrich Hayek's thought on the evolved nature of human freedom and institutions, political, social, and other institutions, and a notion of subsidiarity. Novak thought that subsidiarity developed out of Catholic thought and Catholic teaching. Actually, if you could merge these two worlds, you might get a whole new perspective on what decentralization would look like. And you talk about that in your essay. So let me ask you, what would decentralization look like in our political order that features not just a massive federal government? It's hard to even list all of the departments in the federal government, all the agencies and rulemaking bodies, but also our massive and sprawling state governments that are hooked up to the federal government in myriad number of ways, and also our local governments. We have become a large society of government, and society of government that's increasingly unlimited in how it operates.
Well, great question. And yes, so the point of this essay was to try to take a fresh look at decentralization and try to understand how it can be brought to life. Lots of Republicans, lots of conservatives like to pay lip service to it, but it's striking that as we've been talking about, this power continues to centralize and more technocrats are in power. So I thought I needed to go back to kind of first principles. Why do we do centralization? How has it evolved? What are its limitations? What are its virtues? And I just found Hayek's work and this longstanding Catholic social thought principle of subsidiarity. They informed my thinking, and the best part is the way they overlap and complement one another turned out to be striking. And so there are lots of different breezeways into this topic, but what I would say to start off with is we should have appreciation for the idea that we decentralize in America for a whole host of reasons. Pluralism is a huge part of it. Because of American history and culture and geography, there are different places and different values and different people, and there's no way you can homogenize them without causing a great deal of anger. We also believe in separation of power, separation of authority, and anytime you start to allow any kind of body, especially the federal government, to accumulate authority, you run all these risks, despotism, and so on. And then there are these other things, more moral and ethical, related to initiative and agency and self-determination that we decentralize because it is important for people to have control over their own lives and to be able to form in certain ways. And Hayek talks about this as he distinguishes between, in his great language, an institution, which is created by someone high up, and a formation, which is a much more organic matter. The church teachings on subsidiarity talk about the same thing. And so all of this, this is a long answer to say, we need to think about decentralization in terms of why we do it, but then who should have what types of authority, and this is kind of the core of the concept of subsidiarity. It isn't just radical decentralization, it is the proper assignment of both powers and obligations, and that includes a wide array of not just big organizations, but small mediating institutions, voluntary associations, the proper assignment of authority to those, and then recognizing that within this framework, within this web of relationships, everyone has these obligations, but when someone's not standing up and doing their job, there have to be some sort of interventions.
let's think about here. Let's get into this more specifically. This idea of subsidiarity emerges. I mean, you reference the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's discussed in certain documents in the tradition of Catholic social thought that really starts in the latter part of the 19th century with Rerum Novarum in 1891. But the way subsidiarity thinks about freedom and the human person as a way to ground a decentralized, localized institutions, although allowing for general authority and power as well. Let's talk about that more specifically. What's I mean, there's a depth there, there's a ground there, a belief about the human person that I think authorizes all of this. And I guess my question is, what does that mean to us now in our society, which just speaking generally here, seems to have a very individualistic notion of the human person and a notion of freedom, I think, as will. And I I create things with my will or with my choices versus there being something I'm participating in that's true and that's given.
Yeah, this was one of the best lessons I learned from taking on this project, which is there are some material differences between the way that Hayek conceives of liberty, freedom, and the way that the concept of subsidiarity does. And it does relate to, you can call it natural right, natural law. Like, what is the dignity of the person and what emanates from that? But at least in terms of subsidiarity, throughout the Catechism, which is it's a collection of all of the Church's teachings over time. Throughout speeches, the encyclicals of popes, it is a clear sense that God has created human beings and they have certain rights that to which they are entitled that no one can take away. But coming out of that also are responsibilities and obligations. And now if you transfer to Hayek, he might not use the exact same language, but he will talk about the importance of the liberty of individuals to direct their own lives. Now, what is fascinating about this, and this is where sometimes I get crosswise with some of my libertarian friends, is that is the beginning of the discussion, not the end of the discussion. So liberty, at least conceived of in this article, and I think faithful to say to both Hayek and subsidiarity, is liberty cannot just be conceived of as push all authority down to the individual level and keep pushing it down no matter what. No, actually what both the concept of subsidiarity and Hayek's teachings tell us is that liberty in action means that people decide that they want to do certain things together. They form not only organizations, voluntary associations, families, small governments, but they also form something much more nimble and flexible, things like custom and tradition and norms. And so while some of those things look like they constrain behavior, and often they do, they are not limits on liberty or freedom or the human person. Actually, they are the manifestation of liberty because they represent or they reflect the free choices of autonomous, rights-possessing individuals. And I think we have kind of lost track of that, which is, as we think about decentralization, we have to think, or at least we have to conceive of these voluntary associations, mediating institutions, as being the products of liberty, and they deserve respect.
So within Hayek, I mean, Hayek has this notion. So if you think about subsidiarity and the tradition it comes out of, freedom is something God-given to beings created in his image. Freedom for Hayek and freedom, therefore, for these vast array of institutions he sees forming, where does that come from?
Well, he actually uses this wonderful term, institutions of freedom. And what he gets at in a number of his books and essays is the idea that individuals who are possessing of liberty, who ought to be free of coercion, decide to come together over time and to form things and to evolve things. And so throughout his writings, you actually see a sense of that the governments that we have, the institutions we have, but also things like freedom of speech, freedom from search and seizure. He doesn't use this exact language, but when he talks about these institutions of freedom, they are evolved or they are adaptive. And you can start to see how this relates to his idea of spontaneous order. It's not as though we have to believe that there were dictates coming down from heaven telling us about these organizations or the norms. No, over time, over centuries, over millennia, over a bunch of different cultures, people have realized that individuals living in freedom are going to create these things, and they are going to adapt them, and they are going to evolve them. And they are robust, evolutionarily robust, not just because someone told us or the Bible or some other document dictated that they happen. No, they have proven their value over time. And now that doesn't mean that they don't change. In fact, he argues that we have to be willing at all times to adapt, to evolve, to mold them in different ways. But they are virtuous and they are good because they've proven their value over time, which has helped me to think much differently about kind of the norms and institutions and even organizations that we have.
Well, now let's sort of map this on then to the American political experience. So what you can clearly see if you think about, so the Articles of Confederation fail, I think it's safe to say, in particular because there are coordination problems. There's the inability to coordinate formally in the treaty that the states have signed with one another, and we won't get into all of it, but let's just say it fails. And then the solution is to form, in the words of the Constitution preamble, a more perfect union. So we're trying to form a more perfect union. So there's general authority at the top, and it's national level authority, commerce, to ensure that states can't prevent can't treat citizens from other states unequally and can't prevent commerce, and also the ability to raise taxes efficiently and uniformly, and also most important, defense measures as well can be taken. But then states are left with a vast array of authority, police powers, crucially, moral authority. They're even allowed to form state churches to keep state churches intact. All of this sort of business. So in a way, you see it does map on well to our society. Question though becomes, we all, you and I, and probably most people listening, like to hear this discussion of subsidiarity and like to hear Hayek's discussion of evolved nature of freedom and institutions. But overall goals change of a political society, a movement towards egalitarianism, a movement towards social justice, things like this. How does one make this case for subsidiarity? What does it really depend on for people to accept, and what are the responsibilities? I think that's crucial here. And what are the responsibilities these associations have?
Oh, great set of questions there. So we have to recognize that subsidiarity is often paired in Catholic social thought with this idea of solidarity, that we all have responsibilities to one another, not just to ourselves, and that leads to all types of implications related to how we engage with families and communities and economic policy and so forth. But I think it's important, especially
Now,
in the American...
It's interesting you mentioned that term solidarity, because the left, one will hear actors on the left implore solidarity on behalf of all, confiscatory taxation, or union labor policies, or environmental justice, things like this. What are the limits there? How does solidarity work in conjunction with subsidiarity?
Yeah, so this is so important.
One even hears the Pope use the term solidarity in that fashion. So,
and they have been linked for probably a century or so, and it's remarkable. Folks on the right often only want to elevate subsidiarity. Folks on the left only want to elevate solidarity. But Benedict XVI, the Pope who came before our current Pope, was really clear about this, saying how they go together, that if you only have subsidiarity without having any sense of solidarity, that leads to a kind of atomization. I think he called it privatism, too much just individual stuff, and we can see how that ends up interestingly leading to some kind of both alienation, but then the centralization of power. So he says, be careful if you only have subsidiarity and not solidarity. But he is also extraordinarily clear that if you only have solidarity, that can quickly lead to statism and collectivism. And throughout the catechism, throughout all these different encyclicals of the popes, they are really clear about subsidiarity being a check on collectivism, on the accumulation of power in the hands of faraway officials. And interestingly, there's even like almost a Madisonian sense in part of the catechism, this idea that these organizations, subsidiary organizations, small associations, types of government, and so forth, they should balance one another. They have their own spheres of influence, of responsibility, of obligation, and they ought to check one another. And Hayek talks about the exact same thing, that one of his big concerns isn't just that there are institutions or formations or norms that may start to constrain behavior. The problem is when it becomes monopolistic and they stop other types of people from being iconoclasts or checking power or trying to do things differently. So this kind of element here is important about like this balance between subsidiarity, solidarity, and how these different organizations check one another. And I mean, this leads immediately into the conversation of pluralism. In America, we believe, or at least we used to believe, that unum comes after the pluribus. And so the folks who just talk about solidarity, I think they miss that first part.
Yeah. Now, thinking you referenced the work of a scholar, Russell Hittinger, on subsidiarity, who talks about not just the formation of the groups and sort of their own goods that they're pursuing, but gifts that they have, things they owe.
Yep.
We'll say to a common good, accordingly difficult. I mean, very difficult to define term, I understand. But talk about that, because it seems to me that's also an element working here.
It is, and it leads to probably the core of my argument, or at least the most provocative point, which is subsidiarity, if it's distorted, leads us to believe that we just need to push authority down. It's hyper-decentralization. But no, it actually is this proper assignment of authorities, that individuals ought to do certain things, families ought to do certain things, small communities ought to do certain things. And they have these responsibilities related to raising kids or taking care of the disadvantaged. And Hayek and Catholic social thought are interestingly and refreshingly clear that just because we believe in decentralization does not mean that there is not some sort of role for larger entities, but it is a limited role. And this is where my point, where a big part of my argument comes in, which is I think that, at least now if we're transitioning into talking about policy and politics, that embedded in the idea of subsidiarity is part of these responsibilities is the recognition that sometimes individuals or small organizations are not living up to their obligations. And that can be for a whole host of reasons. But too often, I think conservatives in the policy realm would say, let's decentralize, and then if we recognize that there are failings at the individual community level, the concern is, well, if we get big institutions involved in this, it automatically turns into statism. It has to be hands-off. And then I think that's why a lot of conservative politicians get a reputation for being cold, for not wanting to solve a bunch of problems, because often we give the impression that it's all about benign neglect. Or, well, if the states aren't doing it or if locals aren't doing it, well, let's hope they do. There's nothing really the federal government or Uncle Sam ought to do on this because it becomes too statist. The thing that subsidiarity lectures us on is you have a responsibility to make sure things get done. Now, that doesn't mean that the federal government in perpetuity should take over someone's obligations or in perpetuity take over all of their authority. No. What it means is briefly, temporarily capacitating, making sure that the families, the voluntary associations, the mediating institutions are able to get back on their feet so they can do their job, so we can get back to this idea of social justice, the common good, which is everybody in their place, organizations doing what they're supposed to. And so I try to make this argument that it should be consistent with conservative policy thought, that when we recognize a problem at the state or local level, it doesn't mean just hands off. We actually should view this as a responsibility, or at least an invitation to think creatively of how do we re-energize or catalyze civil society so they can solve those problems, so they can get back to doing their responsibilities.
Now, there's also something in your essay here. There's a way. So we've talked about responsibilities of local institutions. Let's think about responsibilities of the top institution, whatever that institution is, the way it thinks about its role. So we'll say the federal government. Um, it is a role not of comprehensive interference. It's not a role of putting all the players on the board and making them do what you want as if you're the artist or the player. It's recognizing these institutions, recognizing that it may require you to step in, but it's also about, well, how can I help them? Should I, is there a way for me to help them in a way that's not too intermeddling, too much interference, and helps them do what they're supposed to be doing? That, of course, I can't get away though. There's this sense of artifice, or there's this sense of I have the power to do these things. Why should I let you do them? I have more knowledge. I have more skill at the federal level. I have smarter people, more data. Why shouldn't I be allowed to do this? And I can do it better than you. I think I can, at least on paper. To me, that mindset is incredibly difficult to discourage or disarm. And we see this time and time again. And then there's also this ability, as you know, particularly after the New Deal, and New Deal players discovered it, this ability to use money to bring in states to do your bidding, and so that also becomes this enormous problem. And then you get a federal government, and we can talk about this too, that's involved in so many local issues, so many local projects. It's not really focusing on what it should be doing.
Yeah, so let me point out at least two things here, because I agree with you in total, and there are at least two elements that are worth sussing out some. One is there are simply some people who are technocrats at heart, or they talk about it, that they believe that government really should be a matter of experts being in charge, centralized power, and then they can nudge or force however they want. That they think that government is really just a matter of adjusting this knob or that knob, that things like pluralism and localism, those things just are there to distract us. Just get the best and the brightest in positions of power, and they can solve things. So I and others reject that. But I also want to put in parentheses, at least, that I've now worked in 6 different government jobs, and as a conservative, something I have seen both in myself that I have to check and in lots of other people, including conservatives, is even if you don't have that mindset, when you go into the government and you get power, it becomes addictive and intoxicating. All of a sudden, people start to forget that they are there not to get things done, but to enable things to get things done, enable other people to do it. And I'm going to come back to this idea of conditions. That is, very few people, even conservatives, go into government service saying, let me enable other people to get their way. They actually go into government and then they become technocrats themselves, saying, I know the right answer on this. I know the right answer on that. I'm going to use this power to bring about my desired way of life while I have this power. And that is a very different way of thinking about governing than what I think Hayek or subsidiarity would tell us, which is it has to be in some great measure not about ends but about means. I am going to go into a position of power not so I can get my way, but so I can relinquish power to other people, so we can get back to this idea of separation of authorities and different obligations and responsibilities. And just to put a fine point on this, that will mean that conservatives and others who go into positions of power, if they actually do things related to separation of authority and decentralization, in a number of cases, people will use that power to do things that the conservative who is in power doesn't like.
Yeah,
if you
go ahead. No, you go.
Well, I mean, the point here is we have to recognize that decentralization, subsidiarity, isn't always end focus in terms of a policy. No, it's a matter of process. That I believe that the social good will come about if we enable pluralism, if we enable differentiation, if we distribute power, and that means people in Poughkeepsie may do things different than people in Annapolis, different than people in Santa Fe, and that actually is quite disquieting. Very few people go into government service because they want people to do things that the government official thinks are wrong. And so that just leads to this other point that you raised that Hayek talks about, that is throughout Catholic social thought, and people like Nisbet wrote about this, and Burger Newhouse wrote about this, Yuval Levin has written about this, that and it comes across, I think, most clearly in Hayek's Nobel Prize-winning speech, probably 1973, 1974, where he differentiates between thinking about policy, government action, economics, as like an engineer who's tinkering and a gardener. This idea of creating conditions so success happens as opposed to trying to dictate what happens. And that's really what I think that especially policymakers on the right need to think more in terms of, I don't necessarily need to get my way, I want to create the conditions, though, so good things can happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I come back to a point I made. It's a question of who do you think the human person is as well? Do you see the human person as more than just an individual, but with multiple relational contexts, thick parts of their being, family, I work, I'm a citizen, and then I'm connected to a community. If you think of the person that way, then you start to see how your moves on the government, on the policy board, upset those things in the core, in the midst of which, as you're trying to make everything better, et cetera. And it seems, that's just, it's hard to revive that understanding our society. But it seems, we have, I think, largely two conceptions of the person. We have an individualistic notion, which comes out of, I think, our Lockean heritage. But we've also got this collectivist progressive notion, which has emerged as well. But what we need is what Nisbet talked about. And it's what Tocqueville as well talks about, which is this sort of relational person who, even though we move around a lot and do a lot of different things in our lives, we're still ultimately caught up in our relationships. And that's what, that should be the connecting thread when we think about these level of authority, who should do what, how big, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and this relates to how we conceive of individual dignity and what does it mean, and how much autonomy should people have. Where does that end? And then, as I talked about at the very beginning, liberty in action or autonomy in action means that people are going to collect and act in certain ways and develop everything from organizations to norms or traditions or customs. But at least in Catholic social thought, it is very clear that both God endowed people with certain rights and certain dignity and responsibilities, but also, and there are lots of important lines about this, that at least the faith believes that people should be able to direct their own lives. Interestingly, a lot of people probably don't appreciate that the Catechism and lots of encyclicals refer to the fact that the Catholic Church subsidiarity does not require a certain type of government. No, it actually believes in this pluribus idea that there's particularism here. Different communities and different histories and different cultures will lead to different forms of government, and that is fine. But what is important is that we respect the idea that individuals have dignity in and of themselves and that they can use that dignity to do lots of different things. And once you start to become too statist or too atomized, then you start to run afoul of some of these higher level non-negotiables. And I think in lots of ways, Hayek agrees with that.
Now, let me ask you sort of a depressing question, and it's an idea that John DiIulio developed. He had this acronym for it, Big PAP. I won't try to reproduce the meaning of the acronym, but basically it means the federal government has corrupted not only state governments through all manner of spending programs, but it's also corrupted the voluntary private sector as well. And a lot of these institutions you and I are discussing, they actually look to Washington and they go to Washington for their revenue, for their contributions, and for grants, and it kind of authorizes them to do their work. And some of the Catholic Charities would be one that comes to mind, and also they look to the state governments as well. How do we even begin to think about decentralization in that context? Now, the answer is, well, government has to stop doing this. Of course, that's politically very difficult. Is our situation, and DiIulio adds this, the size of the federal government hasn't really grown that much in terms of employees and payrolls. But what they've been actually to do is to coerce and bring on board through various measures a lot of other actors, private and state, to do their bidding, to engage in these policies for them. So how does that? I mean, that just makes what you're talking about very difficult.
It does, and this is one of the current passions of my professional life and one of the reasons why I wrote this article. And at the risk of simplifying things too much, let me give the two things on the two ends of a spectrum and explain to you why I'm trying to navigate the area in between. So if you recognize that there are a bunch of social problems, think of places in Appalachia, in the Deep South, or in some big cities where civil society has so atrophied that people are suffering. There are huge social problems. You could say that the way to solve that problem is just for Uncle Sam to get involved and solve those things permanently. The other way of kind of looking at this is the other side of the spectrum, is saying we ought to do nothing, that for the federal government or big institutions to get involved, it will corrupt, it will distort, it will warp all kinds of behavior, so we have to just keep them completely out. And so you either have, unfortunately, a progressive view of statism being required because civil society and local and state governments didn't solve things, or you have what I call do-nothingism, saying, well, if we do anything on this fact, in terms of these problems, then Uncle Sam's going to get too powerful and he's going to warp civil society to whatever kind of progressive view it has at the time, and that's going to be awful. And so the book that you're alluding to gets this exactly right by pointing out that just because the federal government or state government isn't employing more people doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have more and more influence. And what he was pointing out is that no, through grant programs, through regulations, it can be the fact that nonprofit organizations are increasingly dependent on the largesse of some kind of government. And yeah, the payroll, the number of FTEs of the government may not go up, but certainly the number of people who are dependent on it does go up. So my task, what I've been trying to figure out is how does a conservative policymaker who cares deeply about social problems recognizes that civil society has not been able to solve all of this, or that there are deficiencies in at least certain domains or geographies. How do you recognize that, which is a fact, while at the same time not immediately falling back into statism? And the last third of my article tries to say the way to do this is to think in terms of what are the government programs that can revitalize, catalyze, energize, grow, expand civil society in such a way that the government is giving energy, giving a boost, but is not involved in perpetuity and is not directing civil society. So it's a shot of adrenaline. And this is something that certainly Berger Newhouse talked about, and Nisbet sort of got in the area of Tim Carney and I. Tim Carney has a great new book out on civil society, and I disagree with him about this point. But he gets the same idea.
Alienated America.
Exactly, where he's worried about civil society being atrophied, but his conclusion section is actually pretty anemic because he's worried about big institutions getting too involved. My resistance to that is I'm unwilling to allow civil society to continue to die and just on principle say, well, I'm happy we didn't do anything about it because it would have been too pushy had we done something. I'm trying to figure out ways that limited government programs can catalyze energy and then get out of the business.
So let me just ask you some more, to be more concrete here, because I like what you're saying, but I'm curious for examples. I mean, I think something just in my life here in the state of Indiana, we have an incredibly open set of education policies regarding vouchers, creation of charter schools, the ability online charter schools, and very favorable tax policies if you have your children in private schools, even. But yet, I've been involved with classical schools here in Indiana, and they are reluctant to have any interaction with the state government because it brings in a whole set of requirements, testing measurements that you have to instill in your school that they don't want to because they want to have this classical curriculum, and that can't really get tested. So even that very positive policy direction is fraught with peril. And so I guess my question to you is, what does this look like?
Well, certainly in education, and part of the reason why I've gotten into this larger work in civil society, domestic policy, coming out of education is because I thought K-12 education in particular gave such good lessons and examples of this exact dynamic that you're talking about, that its lessons are stark and they are applicable in other policy domains for sure. So for 100 plus years, we've had a system of K-12 education where we decided that public education was synonymous with a monopoly government provider. A school district that had the benediction of the state would own and operate all public schools in a geographic area, assign kids a school based on their home address, and control all aspects of those schools. That is as statist as you could imagine, but there are virtues to it. These school districts are actually small. It's nice to have kids go to school with their neighbors. There's some community aspects of that. But once you realize that pluralism dictates something different, then you start to run into these challenges that you allude to. So we have charter schooling, which allows nonprofits to run schools within the public education space that are overseen by the government. You can have tax credit programs or voucher programs, scholarship programs that allow private schools to participate in the public system with even more autonomy than charters. But part of that entire discussion is, on the one end of the spectrum, is total state control. On the other end would be something like homeschooling or unschooling, as some people call it, where families just kind of do it quietly by themselves. Once you start to move from unschooling to the left towards more government intervention, controls, financial support, then you have to decide how much government regulation, whether it's testing, whether it's curriculum, whether it's discipline, length of school day, length of school year, are you willing to tolerate? And chartering got its start a little more than 25 years ago. The first voucher program got started a little more than 25 years ago. Indiana has been a leader on both of these for 2 decades. And we are still navigating this argument, which is, how do you have enough pluribus in this differentiation, while recognizing that education, there is an unum to it. There is something that we all have a stake in it, and the government should have some role, whether it's certainly on non-discrimination, but is it also on making sure that special ed kids are getting the exact same services? Do we make sure that, since there are billions of dollars going into the system, that we test kids to make sure that they're actually getting what we want them to? Does it include making sure that all kids get lessons in citizenship? These are live questions that I don't think will ever be resolved permanently, but they kind of reflect these questions about how much should be left up to communities and families, and how much it's a public good, so the government should have a say.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me at the very least, the federal government has no role, I would argue, in any aspect of primary, secondary education, and the money it has thrown into it has not moved the dial at all in terms of education outcomes, to the extent those are actually measurable. And that kind of goes back to the one move back to localism in so many cases is remove the federal government. For me, I would argue. The question too, though, with education is, it seems to me, and this is, maybe we can segue into another aspect of this, is the way we think about education being just about capitalistic development, producing good workers, or as the Common Core standards, college and career ready, and that becomes the way we think about what education is, versus any other idea of education, including a distinct notion in our country that education was also about development of the moral character and citizenship development, and sort of apart from just making good workers. And if you conceive of education in that way, which say the Common Core did, building on, I think, sort of regnant orthodoxy, then you start to see a way to nationalize education, has Bill Gates proposed, and so that's also out there as well, and introduces another complication.
Well, it does for sure, and part of this relates to one of my favorite books, James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, which is, once you start to increase state power over any type of enterprise and start to centralize more and more, when you go from like a family to a community to a local government, state, up to the federal government, and Hayek certainly talks about this in his famous article about the problems of knowledge, that the more you centralize, the central authority has more and more authority over more and more people and institutions, and there is no way that that central body can know everything about every place. And so they have to start to limit the number of indicators, metrics that they're using to assess. And so although there are, 50 million kids in public schools, probably 100,000 different schools in America, the No Child Left Behind Act decided, since we're providing all of this money through Title I to schools, we need to measure success. And since there are so many different schools and communities, there's no way we can measure everything about everything. And so we are going to pick one or two metrics that we can rely on, that are valid and reliable, that can be disaggregated, that can be applied across all of the different schools in America. And hence we become fixated on these narrow metrics, reading and math scores. Mm-hmm. Hence the growth of the testing industry.
So, it seems to me that's the reason No Child Left Behind failed, because at the end of the day, no one wanted to do that.
Well, it succeeded in the sense that it got us recognizing that there are low-performing schools, that reading and math scores can tell us a bunch, but it did elucidate for us that if you are going to measure reading and math scores, and accountability is going to be tied to that and that alone, it totally distorts what a school is all about. And this then becomes, I think, a very challenging thing for progressives in particular, is the recognition that as you get authority pushed higher and higher, the ability to appreciate the diversity in any kind of enterprise necessarily shrinks. So if you actually want to trust in education practitioners and educators, but in housing or in transportation or anything else, if you want to trust communities and empower them, you have to recognize that you cannot have a central authority assuming it knows everything about every single domain and collecting data on all of it. These things actually run at cross purposes, and it's humbling.
Yeah, it's interesting. Andrew Ferguson of the now defunct Weekly Standard wrote a great essay in the midst of the Common Core situation. The notion or this idea of federal education policies to remake and improve American education is basically a graveyard. There's a graveyard of policies that go back to really the Carter administration in this regard, and it's Common Core, to my mind, seems to be another marker. I mean, a lot of states obviously still have this in operation, but the grand attempt of Common Core, it seems to me, has failed. Has been recognized as a failure.
There are people, I think Bill Gates actually has a number of public quotes about this, that he kind of viewed curriculum standards, the stuff of teaching, especially reading and math, sort of like electrical outlets. It makes sense to standardize it and have everybody do the same thing. I just think that reveals to us how little a lot of people appreciate American pluralism, why we have a 10th Amendment, why we trust local governments, why people want to know the folks who are in charge of their kids' schools, and so
have some sort of a say over what could be taught.
That's right. And there is, I want to give the benefit of the doubt to some people who were behind, centralizing efforts. They actually thought what's being taught in Alabama isn't what's being taught in Massachusetts. Kids in Alabama are not getting a fair shake. So is there some way that we can raise the standards across the board? But quickly that then degenerates into standardization and standard tests and the constraining of our definition of what a successful school is. Now, it's absolutely true, at least in my mind, that thank goodness the federal government got involved in Brown versus Board of Education, got involved in some laws related to special education, making sure that education was open and accessible to all kids. But once you get to this idea of the federal government deciding how much money or what is being taught or what kind of tests we're using, then you start to run headlong into individual community agency and pluralism and differentiation. And I think we saw in the Obama administration all that stuff come to a head.
Yeah. No. Now, you and I, deservedly so, have been picking on a lot of progressive policies in this conversation. But increasingly, in the last few months, and stemming back to the election of Donald Trump, a number of conservatives have been calling for national-driven policies, particularly around creating jobs. And thinking about these sorts of areas in America that were seen to be left behind in the globalization policies in the post-Cold War period. Recent essays by Daniel McCarthy, A New Conservative Agenda, which appeared in First Things, Gladden Papin has an essay in American Affairs Toward a Party of the State. Orrin Cass in a different way as a
Mm-hmm.
book, The Once and Future Worker. All of which sort of saying there is a role for the federal government in this regard in commerce and ensuring that work opportunities are available, and saying that they really haven't been available, and there have been falling wages, particularly more uneducated you are, things like this. Your thoughts on this sort of line of thought that we're seeing introduced by conservatives?
Okay, well, let me begin by always a glass half full. I think it is extraordinarily exciting that the ground is fertile when it comes to conservative thought right now. I think we will look back 20 years from now and say that even though the Trump era infuriated me and probably made other people upset, that it has led a lot of people on the right to think deeply and creatively about some of the problems that we're dealing with. And yes, you've identified a number of books that have, and other people have been writing about this for some time, that economic policy and some social policy got so out of whack that a lot of people felt alienated, and not just felt that way, but jobs disappeared and civil society withered. And I think a lot, especially younger scholars, are trying to grapple with what does it mean to be a conservative in this realm. And
Mm-hmm.
without being too simplifying too much, there are the people like, I would say, Cass and Tim Carney, who are very clear about the value of community. And then there are other people who actually do, it seems, want to have a more statist, a more centralized, a more federal effort, kind of like nationalism, populism, economic policy that can then claim to be conservative, which I don't see so much. But a simple way to think about this is, in all of these arguments, how much do the people making the arguments believe in the right, the dignity of individuals and communities to control their own fates? And so this then gets into discussion of how do we think about immigration? How do we think about a universal basic income compared to wage subsidies? And I am much more sort of like a free market, but also I'm a communitarian conservative in this sense. I both believe in free markets and having Uncle Sam take a step back, but also recognizing that we can't treat people like widgets, or we can't treat communities like they're disposable. One thing I'll say is I've been alarmed over the past 10, 15 years by a lot of conservative economists who will simply say, listen, yeah, a lot of men are out of work, but there are jobs out there. Why don't people just move from the hollows of Appalachia, or move from the Deep South to Silicon Valley, or move to Chicago? And I think that some of the free market economists who've been arguing about our economy recently have lost the thread, lost the importance of community, of self-determination, of culture, tradition, history, and kind of think of people as being, just widgets in a big system. And I'm thankful that people like Carney and Cass and Levin, who are thinking much more about the neighborhoods and the history and the culture that come from American pluralism.
So thinking, here also, and just think the debates between Orrin Cass, Scott Winship, Orrin Cass was in Jimmy Pethokoukis recently as well. One concern is, so what exactly are your means? I think to achieve, say, creation of new work opportunities for men who are presently unemployed or inactives, or have not seen their wages increase in the last 30 years by more than 8 or 9% or something like that. What actually are the means that we have at our disposal? And there it gets, for me at least, really vague on what we're going to do or what we could do.
Yeah, and this is why I think Cass's argument about a program of wage subsidies compared to a UBI is so important, because there are some folks out there who would make the case that our economy is growing and there are lots of jobs out there, and so maybe what we actually ought to just do is continue to allow the Silicon Valley types to grow the economy and do really interesting things, and if there are millions of people who are out of work, let's just do a big tax system and redistribute money to give to the people who are out of work who've been displaced by these economic changes. I think Cass and others, and I would put myself in the second category, would say that misunderstands human beings. people need to feel valued. There is value in work in and of itself, even if you're not going to become a millionaire, and this relates back to subsidiarity, that individuals have dignity, individuals have responsibilities and obligations, and work is part of that. And if you have a universal basic income where the federal government is subsidizing people's lives so they don't have to work, going back to the language of the Green New Deal, this people unwilling to work.
People unwilling to work, that's right, yes.
That's right. So there is this is a fundamental point that I think we have to recognize. Subsidiarity, or at least my conception of conservatism, has a set of responsibilities, powers, obligations about individuals, and part of that means work, means taking care of themselves. And just because the federal government could give people money, that starts to distort fundamentally the social fabric. And I'm actually interested in programs, at least in the short term, that enable communities to take care of themselves, individuals to take care of themselves, as opposed to just saying, let's have a welfare program, and as long as we have high GDP, that's enough.
I liked this term that Daniel McCarthy uses in his essay called palliative liberalism.
I underlined that in his article as well.
I thought that was a great term describing this. We will sort of manage your decline in, say, upstate New York or something like that. Thinking about that is in using, say, a universal basic income and not worried about work. Because work connects you to your family, it connects you to your community, it makes you feel like you're a part of something. And in the absence of that, there's all sorts of ways to divert yourself, the screens, the things like that, which lead us nowhere and lead to all of these sorts of social pathologies that we've experienced in striking ways in the past few years that have been brought to our attention. So I think that's right. I think what you're saying is right about thinking about work in that capacity.
At minimum, what we should do more of is when there is a company that is going to shut down a couple plants and saying, well, if we move these jobs elsewhere, we'll be able to use more automation and lower costs will be passed on to consumers. It'll be good for GDP. A lot of us just nodded along for a long time to that. I think we need to bring back into the discussion, no, that's not the end of the conversation there. Do you realize that lost jobs just aren't automatically compensated for increases in GDP if that ends up destroying an entire community, or a set of men are unlikely to ever get work anymore? Just giving them this palliative care of a UBI, that is not enough. Let us discuss why work is important, how that relates to community and individual autonomy and obligation. At least having that conversation seems to be way more important than it's always important, but especially in this moment with so many people out of the workforce.
Yeah. Andy Smarick, thank you for joining with us to discuss with us your ideas for real decentralization in America. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.